Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. I woke up this morning, as I have nearly every day for 2.5 months, to my algorithms feeding me reactions to the presence of ICE in Minnesota. And I wondered to myself, how much more media do we need about this? Not media that informs, mind you. In the upside-down reality we found ourselves in, media that accurately informs about present circumstances has been valuable beyond belief. My concern runs more along two different lines. One where media that informs begins to merge with media that entertains, and two, with my own seeming inability to turn off any stream about what's happening here, feeling a need to know absolutely everything, as though that would help finally spark some idea as to how to make this stop and bring about justice in our world. To put the last two paragraphs more succinctly, I woke up exhausted. And I woke up questioning whether my plan to form this episode around further discussion around what we've seen in Minneapolis is beneficial in any way, or just another clanging cymbal in a sea of noise. Ultimately, as evidenced by the release of this episode, I have decided to move forward, offering you an adapted version of a presentation I gave to our local AND campaign chapter here in the Twin Cities a couple weeks ago. If your soul is tired, as many of ours are with this topic, or if my voice is not the one you need to hear from, I invite you to join us at another time for a different topic. But if you are willing to hear a brief summary of what we've seen, how our history has led us to this point, and what it looks like to learn more about immigration and ongoing public engagement, then please join me for this episode. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources Podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. As we begin here, I want to let you know that there are some visuals, mostly in the form of a couple Instagram posts, that can be a companion for some of this information. These posts will be listed in show notes, and some of the slides will be shown for the YouTube audience. The first of these slides kicks off our discussion here as we ask, what has happened here in Minnesota? And the answer is that we've experienced traumatic events. For work a couple years ago, I made an Instagram post as part of our partnership with the Trauma Healing Initiative about different ways that people experience trauma. And it came to mind as I was thinking about this discussion, this presentation, that there are 3 different ways people experience trauma as told from some information from the Trauma Healing Initiative or the Trauma Healing Institute. There are direct experiences, there's the chance of witnessing experiences, and then you have hearing about experiences. So in direct experience, people can experience trauma after an event they directly experience. Through witnessing experiences, people can experience trauma after witnessing someone else's experience. And then through hearing experiences, people can experience trauma after hearing about someone else's experience. That has happened for us here in the Twin Cities and broadly in Minnesota in so many different ways, not just with what's been happening with ICE. And you don't even have to go back to 2020 with the killing of George Floyd. You can think just in the last however long ago June was, 7 or 8 months, we've had a political assassination, we've had an incredibly destructive, traumatic school shooting in the city of Minneapolis, and now we have what's been going on for the last 2.5 months with the presence of ICE. And we don't really know what this is going to do to us, not just communally, but even at a biological level. There are things that can happen to individuals biologically based off of trauma that they go through, not just, again, from directly experiencing traumatic events, but from the witnessing, seeing other people's experiences, and hearing about other people's experiences. There are things that our body doesn't know what to do with beyond the experience of trauma. It doesn't delineate between different types of trauma. When your body experiences trauma, it experiences it in a specific way and sometimes no matter what the traumatic events are. And not just communally and biologically are we going to see these things, but we're also seeing them economically as well. There was a report that came from the mayor of Minneapolis that we've seen a $200 million impact in the month of January from the immigration enforcement. And that's not just from the enforcement itself. That's from businesses closing down because they've lost workers. That's from people losing wages. We also have people here who have needed to find ways to fund rent because of what has been happening, and people being scared of leaving their houses to even go for their employment, go to their jobs, in order to make the money that they need in order to pay for things like rent, their basic necessities, and other things like that. And another thing I think we need to keep in mind is that this is not just happening to one group of people, one set of people, or one side of the issue and people who stand on a certain side of the issue. We had a discussion amongst our leadership team and with a member of the national team about what's happening here and how we, as a chapter, would respond to that. And one of the things that came up is that the people involved on what some would say the other side, the immigration officials, the federal agents, everyone who is on sort of in that sphere, they are also humans. Everyone who is involved here is human. And one of the things that I mentioned, or that I specifically focused an Instagram post about on the Biblical Justice Resources Instagram page, is that with what's happening here, it's shredding our understanding of our humanity, of the humanity we see in other people, and in that way it is also shredding our understanding of the image of God, both in ourselves and in other people. And this is happening amongst everyone in the situation. As I mentioned in the post and in my original presentation, there's a book called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed by a Brazilian philosopher named Paulo Freire. It's something I've mentioned before on the podcast, but one of his ideas coming out of that book is that the only way you can dehumanize someone else is if you dehumanize yourself. The only way to see someone else as less than human and to not recognize their humanity is to not recognize what is human about yourself as well. And so that's where that thought all comes together here with this understanding of the image of God. And as we've discussed previously on the podcast, the image of God is foundational for so many different aspects of our theology. And so if you want to go back and listen to those 2 episodes that we had discussing the image of God, that also plays into our understanding of what we're seeing here. And it's important to start that foundationally for this topic as well, because we need to remember who we are and whose we are. We need to not just think about what are all the different things that come into play on an immigration side or on a policing side, but who are we and who do we want to be and who are we called to be, and how does that inform how we then react to what we're seeing and how we move forward into the future. That said, immigration does play a part in what we are seeing here. Immigration law broadly and the way that immigration law is being enforced. There's an Instagram post probably a little over a month ago now from Immigrant Connection about all of the different major pieces of immigration legislation throughout the history of the United States. And I won't go through all of it. If you look at the post, you can read through it. If you're watching on YouTube, you may or may not be able to see it with how small each of the slides are on the individual slide. But one of the things I want to point out about a lot of the different pieces of immigration that we've seen is that it seems to be very strongly based on fear and racism. And I think it's important to note that because that is part of our history as a country. This dates all the way back, not even just with immigration legislation, but with the way different peoples and people groups were seen at the founding of the United States. During the Revolutionary War, you have the English settlers looking down, and even the English fighters from England looking down on the German mercenaries, I guess maybe you would call them, but the German fighting forces who were brought in as not being as, I don't know if they would have used the term white, but not as white as the English would have considered themselves at the time. And throughout the history of the United States, you see that with different European people groups, from the Irish to southern and southeastern and eastern European peoples. One of the pieces of legislation that's often pointed to is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which you may be able to tell from the name excluded the Chinese from being allowed to immigrate to the United States, even though many Chinese people had been brought to the United States specifically to work on the railroad. This is a thing you see throughout our history and a thing you see from different immigration advocates that they talk about, is that we as the United States want immigrants' labor, but we don't want the immigrants themselves. This is something that former podcast guest Daniel Carroll R., Dr. Danny Carroll, discusses in his immigration presentations. Another thing to point out here before we move on is that the last real major piece of immigration legislation was passed in the 1960s, the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. That is what really set up the immigration system as we know it today, and that is approximately 60 years old at this point. And that set up a quota system that has numbers that really weren't feasible then for allowing people into the United States, and does not meet the needs of the country now in any way, shape, or form. It also does not meet the needs of the people who are trying to leave situations that they have in their countries in order to make a better life for themselves. Other things to note about immigration in particular before we move on to the enforcement of immigration law is that there are a variety of categories of immigrants, or rather there are a variety of categories of people who come to the United States. So briefly, you have categories like people who are immigrants who are coming to the United States in that way. There are people who are refugees, and there are people who are asylees, among other categories. We'll discuss refugees briefly here in what we've been seeing with refugees who are currently in the United States and what's happening on that end. But refugees are people who flee persecution in their home country for a variety of reasons, are vetted thoroughly while they are overseas, and then are invited to come to different countries, not just the United States. Refugees are resettled in countries across the world. And there are tens of millions of refugees currently around the world looking to be resettled or looking for situations in their home countries to cool down enough to be able to go home. But there are some people who will be born into refugee camps who will end up living their entire lives there, waiting for situations to change. One of the things that's happening in particular with refugees is being referred to as Operation Paris. Refugees, as previously mentioned, are legally present in the United States. However, the Trump administration is looking to re-interview any refugee who was resettled under the Biden administration. In the state of Minnesota, that consists of 5,400 people. And I believe the focus here is primarily on people who have not received their green cards or obtained U.S. citizenship. But as previously mentioned, refugees are present lawfully in the United States whether they become citizens or not. And so the initial way the administration was handling this was sending refugees forcibly to places like Texas and Louisiana in order to re-interview them there, and then releasing them in those places with no way of getting back to Minnesota. A judge has currently put a stay on that operation, at least in terms of sending people to other states, but interviews are still being required now here in the state of Minnesota. And this is a situation where we are re-traumatizing a people group who have already been traumatized based on what has happened in their countries of origin. They were welcomed into the United States because of the persecution they were facing elsewhere, and now we are beginning to persecute them in a similar way. Christians may be particularly swayed by the point that there are Christian refugees who are being re-vetted here, as it were. But as mentioned before, and as we will mention again, everyone is created in the image of God, and the way that we treat everyone needs to be with that dignity. And then briefly about asylees, it's a very similar sort of process, but it happens in the country where a person is claiming asylum. So they're fleeing for the same types of persecution. There is a list of what is accepted as persecution that can count towards, if you will, asylum cases. And then a person is either granted asylum or not, but typically they go through the asylum process in the country where they're attempting to claim asylum. It is worth noting as well that refugees and asylees, when granted those distinctions, when granted access or granted entrance into those categories, are present lawfully in the United States, even if they do not choose to become citizens. There are some different ways that a person can become undocumented in the United States. The two that are probably most well known is crossing the border without papers, without entry permission, something of that nature. Or you can be granted lawful access into the United States on a visa, for example, something like a student visa, and then you can overstay that visa. So a visa allows you to be present in a country for a certain amount of time, and then you can be present after that time in an unlawful or undocumented way. Being present in the United States without documentation is typically a civil offense. It is not a criminal offense. There are some different ways that entering the country can be considered a criminal offense, but largely we are dealing with a civil offense, which is to say, calling everyone who is here undocumented criminals is not the most accurate way to refer to this group of people. So all of this leads up now to our discussion about enforcement. Enforcement has happened in different ways across multiple different administrations. Since the introduction of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, that has primarily been handled under the Department of Homeland Security. So under administration since 2002, you would have the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, that is, along with the Obama administration, the first Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the second Trump administration. During this entire time, advocates have pursued change for how enforcement happens. Millions of people have been deported under previous administrations dating back to 2002 and in a variety of ways prior to that. But what is happening now is different. It is acknowledged as different by the current administration, and visually seeing what is happening out in the world, it is different than what we have seen. And part of what that means for us here in Minnesota is that we all have stories. This in some way has touched all of us. Now, admittedly, I have a bent and a focus on Minnesota because I live here, but this isn't just happening in Minnesota. This has been happening across the country. We've seen immigration enforcement of this nature in Chicago, Charlotte, Portland, both Portlands, Oregon and Maine, and in other places throughout the United States, and there are concerns that it will continue to spread. This militarization that we've seen will continue to spread. So at this time in our original presentation, we went through a process of group sharing. You probably are not listening to this in a group. If you are, you can feel free to share as you're led a story of something you've experienced, something you've seen that has impacted others, or just something in particular that's sticking in your mind about the situation. If you're not in a group and you're listening individually right now, feel free to pause as well and just reflect on what any of those same things, a story that you've experienced, how you've seen others impacted, or just something in particular that's sticking in your mind. This is also the point where I want to talk briefly about what we've seen in terms of changes on the ground here in Minnesota. In the last week, the announcement was made that Operation Metro Surge is going to be coming to an end. But as many different print and news media publications in the cities have been talking about, there are a lot of people here who feel like they will believe it when they see it. A lot of the information that we've seen come from official government channels has been laced with discrepancies, dishonesty, or outright lies at points. And we saw some of these in the announcement from border czar Tom Homan. And there are far too many claims and too many enforcements that we've seen to be able to comment on any of them, or all of them rather. And I don't want to just focus now on he said and correction, he said correction sort of content. But it feels important to note that people who have immigrated to this country, who are living in our community, do not feel safe doing basic things. They do not feel safe sending their children to school. They do not feel safe attending worship services. In both of those instances, staff of schools and parents of children at schools have been patrolling around the school, watching for the presence of ICE in the community. Community members have been patrolling around churches and mosques and other places of worship in the Twin Cities and beyond, watching for the presence of ICE. ICE has been seen around these different places, churches, schools, hospitals, in ways that are meant to intimidate the people using those services or just doing their jobs. And people who are observing ICE activities have had ICE show up at their homes, sometimes either following observers or leading observers back to their own homes. Protests from the people of Minnesota have been remarkably peaceful, and it is important, I think, to note at this point something that I believe I saw Latasha Morrison say on social media, that peaceful protest does not mean quiet protest. People are being loud, but they are doing so well within their rights, and they are speaking out against something that is morally and legally wrong. And there are different things that have been classified as protests by media or by government administration officials that are just people leading everyday lives or people doing legal observer action. Again, referring to something I saw on social media, one thing someone said is that in a lot of different communities, we are not going out to protest, or Minnesotans are not going out to protest. Minnesotans are just living their everyday lives, and the ICE presence is so pervasive that they are just seeing ICE. So what will happen specifically with ICE and immigration enforcement in Minnesota is uncertain in terms of what we're going to see here into the near future. And in terms of the distant future, that also remains uncertain. One of the things I realized and have begun advocating for over the past couple weeks is that one of the ways we could change the way immigration is currently being enforced is through comprehensive immigration reform. This is something that has been worked on for, at this point, decades, and is something I think that we finally need to address. But as Christians, I believe that no matter what a person's legal status, and no matter what a person does for work, no matter what a person does in terms of any other sort of thing, there is a certain sort of dignity that we need to afford all people because of our belief in the image of God. It is not just what we believe, but what we do, what our actions are, that demonstrate who we are as the people of God. So at this point, again, as the Biblical Justice Resources podcast, one of the things I like to do is help people understand what sort of resources are available to them to continue their learning into the future. So in show notes, I'll provide a list of resources that were mentioned in the original presentation, and I'll mention them for you here audibly as well. On the immigration side, I've already mentioned him. Dr. Danny Carroll has written multiple books on immigration. Two of them in particular that I like are Christians at the Border and The Bible in Borders. The Christians at the Border book is a little bit older now, probably 10 years old with its second edition, but The Bible in Borders, I believe, was released in 2020, and both of those are great in terms of helping you understand how to think about this from a biblical perspective. And another book that's very helpful on this is Welcoming the Stranger by Matthew Sorens and Jenny Yang. And a couple video resources on this. There's a feature film called Under the Same Moon, or La Misma Luna in Spanish, that's about 20 years old at this point, but follows the reunification of a family across the border. And then there was a documentary put out in 2014 by the Evangelical Immigration Table called The Stranger, that's about 45 minutes long and is available on their website. Some other organizations you can go to continue your learning include Arrive Ministries, which is local here and is the local affiliate of World Relief, which is a national organization. Also, you can go to the previously mentioned Evangelical Immigration Table or to Immigrant Connection. Resources for remaining engaged or getting engaged include The Power of Proximity and Join the Resistance by another former podcast guest, Michelle Ferrigno-Warren. Also, Racial Justice for the Long Haul, again by a former podcast guest, Christine Jeske. And Faith-Rooted Organizing, which is a little bit older at this point, probably 10 to 15 years old, by Alexia Salvatierra and Peter Heltzel. I know that Alexia Salvatierra also has another book that is maybe more updated with information to help you remain engaged. Other activities that you can do to continue remaining engaged or to get engaged include contacting your legislators. You can go to worldrelief.org/advocate to find some letters that you can sign on to find some different things you can call your legislators about. And as previously mentioned, I've contacted my legislators about comprehensive immigration reform, and that is a thing I think that we need to see. We will see what the process of being a legal observer looks like, depending on how the administration continues to enforce immigration, but I will share a link for legal observer training. That is the sort of thing that's done in person, and the link that I share will be fairly Minnesota or Upper Midwest specific, but you can find other places to become a legal observer. And then some different places that you can donate if you feel so led. Arrive Ministries and World Relief are two organizations you can donate to. The One Fund is a thing I've mentioned on Instagram that's being led by an organization I've worked with in the past, and that is gathering funding to then give out to immigrant churches. Also, just community needs in general. We're seeing schools across the metro and probably also across the state just gathering resources to be able to distribute, and there are a lot of other ways that you can continue to be helpful in that way. To close out here, I want to offer you some different ways that you can continue to pray, not just for us here in Minnesota and for everyone living in Minnesota, but for the country, for immigrants as a whole, for refugees around the world, for the administration, for people involved, all different sorts of categories. So as you feel led, please pray for our city or the city where you live, the state of Minnesota or the state where you live, and for our country. Please continue to pray for immigrants and refugees here in the United States and around the world. Please pray for the church and the people of God, including your church, the broader church, immigrant churches who are fearful of meeting. And please continue to pray for law enforcement officials, federal agents, government officials, and anyone who is working closely with what is happening here. Moving forward on the podcast, I am hopeful to have some conversations about what's happening here with some future guests. And even in conversations where we don't specifically talk about what's happening here, this will continue to inform our podcast episodes as long as this is ongoing, because of my living right in the middle of it, and because it's impacting the church and the people of God in a broad set of ways. Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources Podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.